Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for one of our fabulous Earth Laws Month events. Today, we're delighted to have, I always think of Andrew as both a nature recorder, an acoustic ecologist, but also a deep ecologist. So we're delighted to have Andrew Skeoch here with us today. I'm just going to do some proper opening remarks, and then we'll hand over to Andrew. Please bear with me, and I'll press the buttons. There we go. So firstly, I must give a plug to the wonderful events that really lovely people around Australia have agreed to participate in with us. So Earth Laws Month is AILA's once a year trying to catch up with lots of terrific people and hearing about their work, their information, all in the spirit of generating deep thought and action about how we relate to the living world, how we locate ourselves within the Earth community, and how we can work with each other to try to build a stronger, safer future for all of life on Earth. But I would like to acknowledge country, and it's become quite the Zoom tradition for folks to pop that into the chat. I see that people already are. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the really beautiful lands of the Kabi Kabi and Jinnabara traditional custodians. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and the emerging young people who are continuing their traditions and custodianship of country. I think anyone who knows me knows that I'm in great admiration of how the First Nations peoples of this continent have developed their own governance systems over millennia, since time immemorial. And those governance systems involve deep custodianship, what Elder Mary Graham calls a collective or collaborative ecological custodial stewardship system. So I'd like to acknowledge that land was never ceded, and we are living on, working on, and loving on First Nations country. Australia is an Aboriginal land, and now those of us who are not Indigenous like myself, I find it important to acknowledge country, to acknowledge the First Nations peoples, and also acknowledge my own origins as a descendant of the Irish folks who were brought to this continent by the British Empire. So there's a map of one version of Aboriginal Australia. If you want to put in the chat where you're from, where you are, that would be lovely. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Andrew Skeoch, who I met many, many years ago through more of an arts-focused project, and I've been in deep admiration of his work ever since. So I had to invite him to come and share his remarkable decades and decades worth of listening to nature and learning from nature. And very excitingly, he's written a book all about those activities and adventures. So as I mentioned before, we're going to hand over to Andrew. He'll give a 30 or 40-minute yarn and share some of his beautiful sound recordings, and then we'll go to any chat in the chat box and open up for any discussion. So over to you. Thank you so much for being with us, Andrew.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Michelle. I'll share screen, and I'll just mention, if you've got headphones and you would like to listen in stereo, we are broadcasting in stereo. Many of the recordings are in stereo. So you can listen in a more surround space. So firstly, thank you very much, Michelle, for inviting me to speak today. And I'd like to begin with my acknowledgement of the Dja Dja Wurrung people of Central Victoria. This is where I live, work, play, and make sound recordings sometimes, and acknowledge their elders and their deep care for the land over so many generations. Today, I'd like to talk about listening to the natural world, and in particular, focus on the question of, as you were saying, Michelle, what is our relationship with nature? And more specifically, what can our relationship become? And I'm going to use listening to country, listening to the natural world as a focus for answering that question, because I think it's a really interesting perspective. When you step outside of the anthropocentric worldview, you step out of the visual perspective that we often have on life and listen, because listening allows us to hear the animation and the activity around us. So let's begin with a little bit of listening. And this gives me the opportunity of showing you spectrograms. A spectrogram is a visual representation of what you're hearing, with sound in time progressing along the horizontal axis and frequency from low to high on the vertical axis. The intensity of sound at any particular time and frequency is shown by the brightness of the plot. And normally I would play a recording from where I live, but I thought today, Michelle, I would play you a recording from Gubbi Gubbi lands. This is subtropical rainforest in southeast Queensland. And as you listen, there'll be a cursor that will go across the screen. Just see if you can synchronize what your eyes are seeing and what your ears are hearing in the various species in this recording. I hope you're all hearing that okay. Yeah, a couple of nodding heads there. That's great. So you're hearing the biodiversity of this area. You can hear all the different species. And in that 1 minute recording, that's what you've heard. Normally what I would do is and I suppose it's the first step really, is to listen to the species and understand which species you're hearing, and then think about the behavioral associations of different aspects of their repertoire and how it facilitates their life. And then to recognize that you're hearing the voice of an animal, you have, by empathic listening, a way of sensing its spirit, its life spirit through its voice. And developing that empathy develops your sense of care of other living things, which might live in the world very differently to how we do, but nevertheless, their voice really carries the energy of their aliveness. But rather than talk about all that today, what I'd like to talk about is a broader form of listening, not just listening to species and their individual behaviors, but listening to entire ecosystems and the processes of the natural world. And this first became apparent to me when I visited the island of Sulawesi. It's between Borneo and Papua New Guinea in the Indonesian archipelago. It's the Special K-shaped island, the Kellogg Special K Island. It's a biodiversity hotspot also. It's where Russell Wallace developed his version of the theory of evolution, looking at butterflies, and just it's an extraordinary place because it's on the Wallace Line, and it's the only place in the world where you find the Southeast Asian fauna and the Australian fauna meeting. It's the only place in the world where you find monkeys in gum trees. This is Laura Lindo National Park, and I would go out into this park to record walking up the tracks, and I know that I'm surrounded by such extraordinary biodiversity, but there'd be times when it's almost completely silent, maybe just the susurration of an insect. And then a single bird might fly in, and then followed by another one and another one. And within a few minutes, there seem to be birds everywhere. They're coming through the undergrowth, they're climbing up tree trunks, they're in the canopy, they're fluttering through. Every leaf seems to have a bird hanging off it. What you're hearing and what I've experienced is what's called a mixed species foraging flock. And in temperate forests, in tropical forests, they can be a real phenomenon, like 30 species, sometimes hundreds of birds. They can take half an hour, 40 minutes to actually move through. And when I visited India, some of my Indian friends, naturalists, they call them bird waves, which is a lovely name. And they pointed out that the first bird that flies in is very often this species. It's a racket-tailed drongo, and you can just see one of the rackets on the extended tail filaments there. The racket-tailed drongo is an extraordinary species because it's one of the world's best mimics. It can mimic many of the other species in the forest. And what my friends were suggesting to me was that it acts a little bit like the Pied Piper, that by mimicking all the other birds, it draws them together into these foraging flocks and leads them through the forest. And all those contact calls that you've just heard maintain the integrity of the flock. And I realized that here is a cooperative behavior that unites birds, and it's all facilitated by sound. But there's more to it than that. The drongo it's a highly alert bird. It forages, it sallies forth to collect insects off the wing. It's very alert to its surroundings, and its alarm calls are really sharp and piercing and diagnostic. So it acts like the sentinel for the flock. It not only leads them, but it protects them as well. And what I realized is that this is actually a phenomenon in the bird world. These bird waves don't just occur in tropical forests, although they're spectacular there. They occur all around the world. I was encountering them in Northern Europe, and we have them here in temperate Southern Australia, in the bush around here in Victoria. We have little flocks, mostly in the non-breeding season. Thornbills, shrike thrush, robins, fantails, that kind of thing. And so I was thinking about this whole thing of cooperation in nature. And we understand that cooperation is ubiquitous. So there are symbiotic relationships, for instance, between coral polyps and algae that underlie the functioning of the richest ecosystems, marine ecosystems, coral reefs. In the terrestrial ecosystems, plants, about 90% of plant species require an interaction between their root systems and mycorrhizal fungi. And those fungi, in turn, have relationships with bacteria by which nutrients are taken from the soil, from the matrix of the soil, and passed back to the plant and back again. So these are absolutely fundamental and have been for a long time. Then in more recent times, relatively 100 million years or 120 odd million years ago, flowering plants and developing relationships with various pollinator species across the animal kingdom, birds, insects, small mammals. This is a cassowary poo. It's estimated that around about 200 rainforest trees require their seeds to go through the digestive gut of a cassowary to germinate. So cooperation is ubiquitous in the natural world. And, you know, if you listen to documentaries, you'd get the sense that nature is shaped by competition, that it's a struggle for survival of the fittest. It's a jungle out there. But the more I thought about it, the more I sense, and particularly in listening, I'm hearing something else. And it really came home to me, not so much through listening, but by watching this animal. This is a black wallaby or a swamp wallaby, and we have them in the bush here. They're very shy animals. They're quite retiring. You will mostly only ever see them singly. But on one occasion, I encountered two males interacting with each other. And I just want to show you the video of this because it really is quite extraordinary. Now, you would say that this is a contention over probably breeding status, but I want you to watch carefully what these two animals are doing. Firstly, their forearms are locked around each other. Their heads are moved back out of the way. And you can see them trying to knock the other one off its balance. The game seems to be to upend the other one, not to sort of kick the stuffing out of it. You can see that it's a very formalized behavior. These animals know how to do it in their DNA. It's part of their inheritance. It's part of being a wallaby. It's very physical. You can see this animal panting at the end. But when it hops away, it's not injured. Now, these behaviors have a biological name. They're found throughout the animal kingdom in various ways. And the word is agonistic. They're agonistic behaviors. And I love the word because it's the opposite of antagonistic. And the object of these behaviors, the purpose of these behaviors, is to resolve what could be competitive situations in a way that doesn't cause harm to other members of their own species. And I started to think, I mean, I've seen this in many other animals. As a matter of fact, it's, as I said, it's right throughout the animal kingdom. And some of them are really, they have these beautiful agonistic behaviors. Giraffes whack their necks together. It's the most graceful, it's a real dance. Once again, very physical, but they've got to synchronize. They're bringing their necks together. If they don't get them right, one animal could topple with really bad consequences. So anyway, agonistic behaviors are found throughout the animal kingdom. And I started to think, well, maybe we can hear them too. And the obvious possibility was in the dawn chorus. Now, the dawn chorus occurs in that hour before sunrise. And I've been recording dawn choruses around the world for 30 years now. And you start recognizing patterns and things in common in different parts of the world, even though the dawn chorus is different everywhere you go, different species and so on, you recognize patterns. So one of them is that birds, what I call sequence, that some birds will start early in the dawn chorus, others join a little bit more towards the middle when it's really building up to a crescendo, and other species might wait until the end, and they might even sort of morph into the morning bird song. So you get this sort of collection of species that sequence themselves. The other thing is that whilst many birds call at dawn, it's really the songbirds that are participating and creating the dawn chorus. Now, songbirds are probably about half the bird species in the world are songbirds. They're all passerines. And this group of birds, what's unique about them is that they learn their songs. They have to learn, they inherit their voice, but they have to learn their actual songs. They learn them from their parents, and from their community. And they often learn throughout life. And this gives them some really interesting possibilities that non-song learning birds, like say pigeons, which also call in the morning, can't do. The third thing is that it's seasonal, and that tells you that it's related to breeding. So there will be, in spring and summer, you'll get a dawn chorus. In the autumn and winter, it will pale away. Birds will still call in the dawn, but not much. It's sort of, infrequent. And so the fact that birds learn their repertoires means that as you move around the country, you hear in a particular species, you hear regional dialects. They learn a local, exactly the same as we do. They learn their regional dialect. So this is a willy wagtail. They occur right across the country, and wherever you go, you hear their voices they have a slightly different song phrase. So here is a dawn chorus of willy wagtails, and just notice the fact that they are all singing pretty much the same song phrase. Now, the fact that they all share a song phrase is equivalent to saying that they share an identity. Does that make sense? And sharing an identity, in our way of saying it, is that they share a community. And I think the fact that birds sing in this way at dawn is a way of creating community amongst a group of resident birds, each of which might be a pair-bonded breeding pair in their own particular home range, but across the landscape, they form a community. And I think the reason that they do that, as with many bird aggregations, is simply for safety. There's safety in knowing who your neighbours are. There's something else that these woolly wagtails are doing. If you notice, they're actually kind of taking turns to sing. They're not all singing simultaneously or continuously. They're singing sporadically. So they're actually taking as much time to listen to each other as sing to each other. And this process is called counter singing. This bird is my favorite counter singer. This is a white-fronted honeyeater. It's an inland bird, and they put on such a spectacular performance where two birds will alternate their calls. Their repertoire is the most wonderful collection of it. It's like an entire library of mechanical sound effects. Have a listen to these two birds. They'll sing for half an hour, 3/4 of an hour doing this, and just listen to the precision of how they interlock their voices, almost as if it's one performance, but they're alternately singing. This is a white-eared honeyeater. It's a bird that we have where I live, and it gives us a little bit of a clearer idea of this counter singing, just how precise it can be. They sing in summer, spring and summer, through the dawn choruses like this, and here you can hear two birds really alternating between the two of them. Now you'll notice exactly the same song phrase that they're using, the alternation, the counter singing. Another aspect of the dawn chorus is that this song phrase that the white-ear is using is unique to the dawn chorus. It will sing it at other times of the day, but what's interesting is that it's the only call that is used in the spring and summer dawn chorus. In the cooler months, it will also sing a little bit more sporadically in the dawn, but when it does so, it uses an entirely different or different aspects of its repertoire. So this is the white-eared honeyeater in winter. So all of this tells us that the dawn chorus is a ritualistic behavior. There are particular formalities and processes that birds use sonically to interact with each other in that hour before the dawn, and things that they do then that they don't do throughout the rest of the day. But it gets even more complex and fascinating. This is the grey shrike thrush. It's one of many Australians' favourite birds. It has a beautiful melodic song, which really rings through the bush. And I was curious about the birds that live around our place because I felt they were doing something interesting in the dawn chorus. So I put microphones out to actually hear exactly what they were doing. And what I heard just, it really amazed me. So they didn't join the dawn chorus straight off. There were other birds that began, fairy wrens and so on, that began singing. They waited about 15 or 20 minutes before they began singing. And when it did, it was one bird that lived close to us and was near the microphones that began singing. And about a minute later, its neighbour, about 200 meters away, also began singing. these birds have a repertoire of maybe 20 or 30 song phrases. Out of all of those song phrases, they were choosing one song phrase to alternate and do their counter singing between the two of them. Can you hear that? They're singing exactly the same phrase. And this carried on for maybe 10 or 12 minutes, I think. And then one of the birds changed the song phrase, sung a novel phrase. Within 15 seconds, the other bird had picked it up and was also singing exactly the same song phrase. Once again, another 10 minutes or so, and a new song phrase entered into the discourse. By this time, the dawn chorus was starting to wane away a little bit, and you could actually hear shrike thrushes across a vast, like from kilometers away. Cool air in the morning when birds do the dawn chorus is really good for transmitting sound. It's why they sing at dawn. But you could hear these birds. It wasn't just these two birds. There were probably about half a dozen of them within hearing range, and they were all singing on this new song phrase. So to me, the sophistication of this behavior firstly says it's really important that it would evolve in the way that it does, that it has, but also that it's a negotiation. And it's a negotiation not in competition with their neighbours, but in collaboration, in cooperation with neighbours to create communities and create and acknowledge each other. So I just want to pause at this point and let you digest some of that. I'm throwing a lot of ideas at you, and I'll just let you rest for a minute or so in the cloud forest of Papua New Guinea. The lesser ground robins, regent whistlers, blue-capped ifrits, lorikeets, once again an extraordinary collection of birds, many of which are related to birds that we have in Australia. Now, the reason that I'm taking you to the New Guinea cloud forest is that I want to introduce another idea at this point. And it's the idea that, or the phenomenon that in these kind of forests, you hear a daily cycle of sound and silence from the inhabitants of the forest. There is a daily sonic cycle. And if I start in the middle of the night, it's characterized by a nocturnal insect chorus, frogs, usually small tree frogs. In this case, in this recording, there is a feline owlet nightjar, which is a very small owl, and you can hear the scream of a sooty owl in the background. So for 12 hours, the forest sounds like this. It's just a pulsing, ever-present sonic bath that you live within. And then the dawn chorus arrives. and the place goes absolutely nuts. At the end of that, there's a little bit of a hush at the end of the dawn chorus, but the morning bird song continues. But by mid-afternoon, the sound of the cloud forest has transformed completely. This recording is at the same volume as what you've just been listening to. The forest goes almost completely silent. And in that silence, there is a lack of cognitive stimulation. It's like all the creatures in the forest, their cognitive stimulation levels are suppressed for a couple of hours. And these kind of processes occur because of feedback processes in ecosystems. As ecosystems become complex, they develop these rich layers and interactions of feedback processes, of interactions between different creatures. And so when you hear this kind of the dawn chorus, the activity, and then the suppression of activity, you're hearing feedback processes. Now, there are basically two kinds of feedback processes, positive and negative. And just to give you an example of a negative feedback process that we're all familiar with, hunger is a negative feedback process. So as you get hungry, your nutrient levels are going down, you get hungry, and so you eat. Hunger goes down, your nutrient levels go up. So it has an inverse correlation. And the result is homeostasis, that your nutrient levels remain relatively stable or within an operating, stable band. So this is a negative feedback process within our bodies. A positive feedback process is more like addiction. It doesn't matter how much you have. As a matter of fact, the more you have, the more you want. So that's a positive feedback is one that just builds and spirals and feeds back and grows out of control. So the processes in ecosystems are a mixture, actually, of both negative and positive ones. And overall, they create not just a monotone homeostasis, but a dynamic homeostasis that changes and fluctuates as these processes interact with each other. Now, this quiet in the afternoon, I think, is the result of a positive feedback process where the quietening of each animal becomes the quietening of the whole forest. Left alone, it would just stagnate as a quiet forest when no one was saying anything. But just on dusk, something happens. The silence is completely shattered by the dusk cicada chorus. This recording doesn't do justice to them. This is loud. This is your eardrums are rattling around inside your head. It's just you're just surrounded by this sound. And my colleagues call these dentist drill cicadas. So what's happening here, I think, is that the the positive feedback process that leads to the hush in the afternoon is broken by a circuit breaker, by something that just completely disrupts the whole balance and kind of resets the whole system. And at the end of that dusk cicada chorus, we are into the nocturnal insect chorus that I began playing with, and the whole cycle starts all over again. So nature is rich in these cycles, and the object of the exercise is dynamic homeostasis. And that, I think, is one of these dentist drill cicadas. So it's worth reflecting at this point that life has been on our planet for several billion years, probably at least. And in that time, natural selection has certainly acted to bring out different species, but it's also acted to bring about behaviors for those species and interactions within entire ecosystems. And natural selection acts to work to bring forth, to sustain life. If a process doesn't work, if a behavior doesn't work, it simply disappears. So when we're hearing and experiencing these things now, it's because nature, evolution gives it a stamp of approval, that this works, that this sustains life. So I've been reflecting a bit on what we can learn from this. And it seems to me that if we're going to learn from what nature does, this is referred to as biomimicry. And if we're learning about how to live on this planet, then it's a kind of what I'd call social biomimicry, if you like. And I'd like to propose a couple of ideas just to consider. The first is that as individuals and as a society, we think in terms of fostering a listening culture. Now, indigenous cultures all around the world are listening cultures. They learn, they listen to the land, they listen to the natural world around them because they have to learn about what's going on around them. In our modern world, we don't need to do that, and we've actually lost the ability to listen to nature. And part of my work is I've had to learn how to do this myself and to share with you how to listen, what to listen for, and the skills of listening. So it's both personal, it's philosophical, it's cultural, it's also rational and scientific. Sound gives us so much information about the natural world, and science is really having its awakening moment of just how to start monitoring and understanding the dynamics of the natural world through sound. So it's both rational and spiritual. We need to bring all of ourselves and our entire culture to becoming what I refer to as listening peoples, because we've forgotten how to do it. The second thing is to think about these agonistic processes. Now, I guess the question is, if every animal on the planet has these agonistic behaviors, why don't we seem to have the same thing? Why are we so violent? Why do we have warfare? Why do we hurt each other so much in one way or another? And I think the reason is it's so obvious. It's that we are an intelligent species. And this intelligence, whilst it gives us wonderful capacities, is also the bane of our existence, because we can imagine things that simply aren't there. We can create things out of our imagination, and we can behave in ways that transcend our biological nature. In other words, we can transcend any agonistic processes that we might have inherited. We can choose to do harm to others if we wish. So applying, or appealing to people's individual natures is simply not going to work. And we've seen moral cultures not succeed at restraining violence throughout history. The only way to do it, I think, is the way that nature's done it. Nature encodes agonistic processes into our DNA. Now, we can't do that. We have to encode it into our civil institutions. It's our systems of governance, our systems of economics, our systems of law that have to embody our agonistic processes, the agonistic processes of our species. And those agonistic processes are things like respect, inclusion, tolerance, negotiation, diplomacy, truth-telling, listening, kindness. You'll notice that many of these are communicative. So our civil institutions need to be places where these processes are embodied, celebrated, and practiced. The third thing is to think about those feedback processes. And in terms of the way that we've structured our world, many of the feedback processes that we have are actually positive feedback processes. Wealth creates the possibility and the desire for more wealth. Power for more power. You know, you hear about people failing upwards. Privilege leads to more privilege. And on the opposite side, poverty can spiral down into an inescapable, just a depressing, inescapable state. We do have circuit breaker mechanisms and oversight mechanisms to break these positive feedback processes, things like governmental interventions, charities, investigative committees and so on that can try and break these positive loops where power becomes concentrated, wealth becomes concentrated. In a way, the whole colonial project is a positive feedback loop because it concentrates power in the wealthy countries and the elites of those wealthy countries. So negative feedback mechanisms would attempt to smooth that out, and they'd have these circuit breakers and accountability mechanisms. But so much, whilst we might have positive feedback, economy, governance, and so on, with effective circuit breakers and accountability, so much better to simply set up a negative feedback social structure, economics, and so on. I'm going to take another little pause. I'm going to play you my final recording. And this will give us some context for where I feel that we are currently, our current situation. Grey striped thrush again, white-naped honeyeaters, golden whistlers. I'm playing this recording by way of context because this habitat no longer exists. This is Waratah Flat. It's a place, it's a mountain forest in Far East Gippsland in southeastern Australia. It was completely immolated by the Black Summer bushfires. I watched, this recording for me comes from 30 years ago. It was one of the first nature recordings that I made. And it's just the most magical place. And for me to watch the news and look at the fire maps and realize that this place was gone. And it's an ancient place, these forests, a lot of the species that live here, that they date from Gondwanan periods when much of the continent was this kind of wet forests. just burnt to the ground. They won't recover in the way that the biodiversity that I experienced then, or if it ever does, it'll take an awfully long time. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in, unprecedented and existentially threatening. What I've just suggested, these 3 points about listening culture and agonistic processes and setting up feedback mechanisms for homeostasis, I feel as though they're so important because they sit at the very foundation of how we live. We can set up developmental goals and climate targets and a whole range of things, but if we don't get to grips with how we live on this planet, we're simply not going to achieve those. We'll get a decade down the track and go, oh, well, we tried. That's not good enough. If we're going to survive, we have to think about these fundamental ways that nature has evolved to ensure its own continuance, its own sustainability. So this is the power for me of listening to the natural world and listening to country. And I'll leave it there. And I'll just finally mention that in my book, I expand on these ideas, probably articulate them a lot more clearly as I am off the top of my head now. There's also, the book comes with about 300 audio recordings. There's a whole soundtrack, some of which I've played for you today. So thank you very much. And I'll drop out of this and we can go to some questions.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was fantastic as always, thought-provoking, challenging, sometimes depressing, but so beautiful. And I couldn't agree more. Our society absolutely needs to listen to the living world, not just to learn from it, but to value it and know it's all there. There's some wonderful comments coming through. People are really just saying, thank you for your work. Thank you for the wonderful presentation and book. A couple of people are saying it's so beautiful and then heartbreaking that that ecosystem was lost. While people settle in and have a little think, because we've got about 10 or 15 minutes for a chat, I've got some burning questions, Andrew, if that's okay. And while I do that, I'm actually going to keep putting into the chat the link to Andrew's book. And sorry, Andrew, I'm going to give a quick plug for your other work. If you would like to see some of Andrew's work, you can look at his website. You can also look, and this is a plug for Ayla too, we have an eartharts.org.au. Oops, I accidentally sent that to one person. I do apologize, folks. Eartharts.org.au. If you click on that, you'll come to the Australian Earth Laws Alliance's Arts and Creativity website. Ayla runs a range of activities, often every second year, with the Earth Arts Collective. Andrew's been a wonderful member of our ongoing discussions and group, and you'll find a link to his recordings there, as well as connection to other artists. So please do check out that site. And I have shared a couple of times a link to Andrew's book, but his recordings are quite remarkable. Anyway, back to my question, Andrew. This might seem really obvious, but why do birds have a dawn chorus? Because they could have a lunchtime chorus. Now, is it because they get up and have a coffee and feel perky? Or what's it all about?
Well, I think it's because creatures do need to negotiate physical resources, of whatever kind. It might be food resources, nesting hollows, breeding opportunities, whatever. And so for birds, particularly when they're in that breeding phase, they need to negotiate their relationships with their neighbors, to acknowledge them and so on, create safety with their neighbors. And the dawn chorus is simply that negotiation, and it's incredibly complex and sophisticated and subtle, depending upon the species and what they need to interact with their kindred species. And
to be flippant, yes, is it like a bunch of housemates waking up and organising who's going to shower first?
It's an interesting analogy. I'll think about that one. That's taking me back a few decades, unfortunately. Yeah,
I like that, the idea that they're waking up and they're already negotiating with each other. Hey, I'm here. Where are you? Those kinds of
discussions. Yeah. This is my space, and that's your space, and it's the fact that it exists really is so extraordinary, because you're right. It doesn't have to be there. Like a lot of other animals don't call at the dawn. Mammals don't. You know, for mammals, most of their lives, their communication is more in the sense of smell. They mark their territory, scent trails, and so on. But birds are really, birds are creatures of sound, and so they negotiate as we do. We are creatures of sound, and this is why I think what they do is so relevant for us to learn from. That they negotiate their space in a way that they don't have to even do this physical engagement that mammals do. And they just get it all over and done with in that hour before dawn, when they can't really go foraging, you know, at that time anyway. So they do that, and then they get on with the rest of the day.
I think it's beautiful. Thank you. There's actually a terrific question here. I've lost it. There's been a few other. I'm sorry, I can't say the person's name. I've lost the comment. Could you comment perhaps on how birds that seem to be more solo communicate, like bush turkeys, malleefowl, those that don't flock or hang out with others very often?
These birds are not songbirds. They are non-song learning birds, so they inherit their calls, and they utilize them to keep in touch with each other. What's named the scrub fowl in particular are very much nocturnal callers. You'll hear them sort of cackling away in the rainforest at night. I'm not sure. Brush turkeys are not very vocal. They'll kind of grunt a little bit, but they're not big communicators. But as you say, they live a fairly solo existence. They're very brightly coloured, so maybe most of their communication is visual rather than acoustic. But every species has its own particular sort of communication networks and strategies. What's unique about songbirds is that they learn and they do this dawn chorusing thing, and it may well be their greatest evolutionary achievement. As a matter of fact, it may be why half of the world's bird species fall into this group, because it's just been the most spectacularly successful strategy. Whereas poor old brush turkeys are still chasing each other around the forest floor.
I love it. Actually, Anand has asked a question too, relevant to the question I asked about the dawn chorus. If the birds use a dawn chorus to develop and maintain relationships with neighbours, could you say it's also to see if the bird in the adjacent territory is still alive and well or not, and whether they could move into that space? Would there be some element of that?
Yeah, I think so. What's more interesting is that when birds mature and they disperse to find their own territory, they will arrive in an area. If they integrate straight away and start singing, they're going to stick out as being a bird from another area, because they're going to have a different regional dialect. And I often think of the image of a sort of grizzled hippie going, "You're not from around here, are you?" So I think a bird has to kind of learn the local dialect to fit in, and in the process of which it's kind of sounding out where the territories are and where the home ranges are and where it can fit in. So it's fitting in to that whole community through adopting the dialect. And it's exactly the same as us when we go to live in a different place. We not only learn the language, but you really learn the idiom of that language.
That's wonderful. Just going a little deeper into these observations about cooperation, can we sort of jump into the work that you have done, looking perhaps at some of the theories that people associate with Charles Darwin? Survival of the fittest was sort of a much maligned concept. Social Darwinism took on those ideas to justify everything from racism to technological progress. But a lot of other people, including Darwin, did look at the cooperative nature of life on Earth. Did you want to talk a little bit about what you've learned by not just sort of seeing, oh, birds cooperate, but how what has it meant for you looking back at what folks say about competition being the thing?
I think the whole idea about competition really comes from our Western ethos, that we tend to dominate and own. We do that with land. We do that with other peoples. We do that with wealth and the resources of nature. Our civilization is built on these resources. So for me, the whole idea of competition is more a projection of the Western mind than it is something that actually exists in nature. There is the potential for competition in nature. What I observe is that nature avoids the costs of competition in the most extraordinary ways. And these agonistic behaviors are a general sort of catch-all way of describing them, of which the dawn chorus and birdsong generally is the avian example of it. It's interesting that the expression survival of the fittest was not one that Darwin originated. It came from a thinker by the name of Herbert Spencer several years after Darwin had written his Origin of the Species. And Darwin thought more in terms of natural selection, but it was a term that he wasn't comfortable with because it implied a godly selector. And he was a much more secular thinker. So he accepted the idea of survival of the fittest. It was actually Wallace who recommended it to him, but he wasn't really comfortable with that either. And I think the problem is really in our language, that we struggle to understand nature for two reasons. Firstly, our language, the vocabulary that we have is limited around these things. Our vocabulary is oriented towards our own activities. We defend territory. We are aggressive. We own. Nature doesn't work like this. We just don't have words for what nature's doing. So it's partly language, and it's also the fact that as a Western culture, Western industrial culture, we have removed ourselves from nature. We've managed nature to such an extent that we think that we're not subject to nature. But the reality is, nature still holds all the cards. It always has, and it always will. And this is why we need what has been called deep adaptation, to think really deeply about how we live on this planet and how we're going to organize our societies. Incidentally, this whole idea of sort of hierarchical capitalist kind of colonial societies is a relatively recent one. We think that it probably only goes back about 5,000 years. And if you look at societies before that, which we have a lot of archaeological evidence for now, we see societies that live in a much more egalitarian way. There are obviously people of status, but they're not necessarily kings and queens, monarchies. So it looks as though if we go back to antiquity, or before antiquity actually, to our ancestral state, we can not only look to indigenous cultures, but also to what we would think of as the precursors to Western culture, and see that these societies were far more innovative. One archaeologist has described them as playful. They were experimenting with different ways of living together. And they'd sometimes do these in different ways at different times of the year. They'd move from one place to another, and they'd join bigger aggregations of people and behave in different ways. So the way that we think is absolutely normal and necessary is not at all the way that people have lived throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
So
you're speaking to my heart there, Andrew. Yeah, no. Like, anyone who knows the work we do in AILA, a lot of the work we do is remind people of colonial origins and the very origins of our Western society, and the law and the economics and the division between ideas that they call disciplines. So no, the history of the way we are is really important. And look, we're out of time. We're just coming up to just past the end of our allotted time, but I want to give another plug. Andrew is going to be a guest speaker at the New Economy Network Australia's conference in Canberra, that a whole bunch of us are organising together. And it's the conference is called Life After Capitalism. As Tim Hollow from the Green Institute often says, it seems easier to imagine the end of the world than it does to imagine life without capitalism. And I think Andrew's talk will be a plenary on one of the mornings on the weekend to remind everyone about this nature of being in cooperation, and that the systems we have today don't have to be harmful to each other. We can change and we can do things a little better. So, but on that note, I just want to say a huge thank you, Andrew. Yes, please have a final comment. I'll say a huge thank you to everyone please do check out the rest of the Earth Laws Month program, and please do buy Andrew's book. Keep him working on these important issues. And Andrew, would you like to say goodbye to everyone?
Thank you all for being here. And what I love about AELA is that you are actually pioneering and pursuing this work of how we can live differently. And that's why I love being a part of this community. So thank you to you, Michelle, and all of your team, because it's really important work. And I think you're absolutely right. We're in the process of having to imagine how to live differently. We're not going to see it off Hollywood blockbuster screens. We've got to work it out for ourselves and put it into action in small ways in our lives, because there might come a time, indeed, nature will probably throw a circumstance, we've already seen this with COVID, where the whole world has to turn on a dime and work out a different way of being. So the work that you're doing, the work that we're all doing, is a vital part of reimagining or imagining what our future can be.
Oh, beautiful. What a lovely way to end our session. Thank you again, Andrew. Always a pleasure to listen to you and your work. And thank you to everybody. Hopefully we'll see you in another session soon. Don't forget, tomorrow is all about decolonizing our thinking, feelings, and action with Mary Graham and Yin Paradise and myself, where I will dig into the history nerddom that I love so much, and the wisdom of Mary and Yin will be terrific. Anyway, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Andrew.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.